Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, in person or online. This is going to be an interesting session. This is called Green Hydrogen. This session, as well all of these sessions, are organized by the CCG, Climate Compatible Growth. CCG is funded by the FCDO, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, to support investment in sustainable low-carbon development systems to meet development priorities in the Global South.
Thank you. If you wish to ask a question at all throughout this discussion, please use Slido. The link is www.slido.com and the code is 2715656. I'd now like to introduce you to the chair of today's session, Stephanie Hermer. Stephanie is the Research Manager and Advanced GIS Modelling Co-Lead for CCG for the University of Oxford. Thank you.
So hello and welcome to this rather different session. We decided to bring actually a lot of people into this discussion with very different backgrounds and different knowledge. So we have political economists here, we have people from the transport sector, people that work on material dimensions, and what we're really here to discuss is this excitement around green hydrogen that has not been unnoticed at this COP27 here in Sharm el-Sheikh. Almost every single session we go to, green hydrogen is mentioned in one way or another. It is kind of perceived to be a new technology that can potentially transform and really push forward this transition to net zero. So when we talk of green hydrogen, it's obviously produced from renewable energy, as opposed to when we have grey hydrogen, which currently is the majority, can't think of the word, makes up the majority of hydrogen utilized. So there's currently around 120 megatons of hydrogen demand in 2020. And so really, what is the role of green hydrogen in this net zero transition? And the excitement doesn't just come from the global north, as obviously we are at war and Ukraine is in war at the moment, and obviously that has probably heightened this debate. But it's also not. It's also there amongst actors in the global south. I've been to a talk yesterday around the visions for Africa's energy future, where also Jakob here has been party to. And for example, here it came also out that there's a role for Africa needs to take advantage of green hydrogen and green ammonia and to decarbonize the world. And it's also seen as a technology to really move Africa along. And in fact, here at COP, there have been already numerous pledges and announcements in really leapfrogging green hydrogen. So I just want to read out a few that also I've been told today that Kenya has signed something, but I haven't read it, so I can't report on it. But so, for example, Germany, so Ursula von der Leyen has signed 3 initial agreements for import of renewable hydrogen, so for Kazakhstan, Namibia, and Egypt. Egyptian presidents announced the launch of the Hydrogen Norwegian project, and then Mauritania has signed an MOU with BP for a 30 gigawatt green hydrogen plant. And this is only what has taken place from Monday and Tuesday. These are huge pledges, and what they all have in common is that they are driven by international finance in countries in Africa. And while this is very attractive climate finance, I think there's also obviously significant risks for countries that are signing up to these green hydrogen plants. And we need to be very careful that countries also prioritize their own needs whilst fulfilling some sort of export market. Otherwise it can backfire for the countries, which is often commonly referred to as a resource curse literature. And amidst this excitement, I think there's also been a number of things that have been highlighted, what is needed within the context of Africa regarding to green hydrogen, and that is finance. So, for example, I went to another talk today at the World Bank Pavilion, and it was mentioned that 500 billion have been attributed to green hydrogen, but only 2% of these projects have actually made it to financial close. all of these projects were in the global north. And while there's a lot of finance available on the African continents, most of it is within 4 countries. And I hope I got my stats right here, so please anyone correct me on this. I believe it was South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya. Another point that was mentioned that is really, really important is basically capacity. And everyone's been mentioning a tremendous willingness of governments to explore this new technology, but there's not really the ability to take it forward. And I think also these pledges that have been made are obviously showcasing how willing governments are to actually venturing into green hydrogen. So I think what we're really hoping to do in this conversation amongst people with lots of different expertise is maybe talking about what we think might be a potential role of green hydrogen, but what also we are quite concerned about, and maybe where certain roles are. Are there potential winners and losers in this debate? Who is driving this? And I think perhaps with that I move over to Jakob, who is my co-chair in this. And Jakob, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay. Hello, I'm Jakob Mulugeta. I'm a partnership lead of CCG, but also University College London. I mean, it's as Steffi said, you know, we are sort of navigating this hydrogen territory in terms of the possibilities that it may bring in terms of energy, but also servicing, supporting agriculture. But at the same time, also, it feels that there are still, the research is still out there trying to pull together the evidence whether this has, the kind of value, the kind of benefits that it will bring, not only to countries, but more importantly to communities. I mean, the reason why I'm saying this is that, hydrogen is not going to sit, on its own, but there are going to be questions around water, around land resources, and a whole host of other issues related to, to finance. Renewable energy, of course, is going to have to be delivered at a much, at a huge scale, something that hasn't happened, for other services. So there are so many, questions around it. I mean, there's going to be competition between, the whole energy access agenda, but also hydrogen for, whether it's industry, transport, and in some cases also export. So there are so many dimensions to the whole hydrogen discussion. Of course, initially what we thought about was, inviting someone to talk about, an expert to talk about hydrogen, but also get someone, favoring one side and another, person raising some of the issues or the risks associated with it. But that hasn't happened. But we thought, this would be an interesting way of doing it in the absence of that, to essentially see what's been happening in the COP and bring it here into our sort of informal discussion, which Steffi has been following a lot of the hydrogen discussions and actually laid it out here for us. So I think it's one of these territories which seems to be responding, yes, to decarbonization. It seems to be responding to Africa's need for agricultural as well as industrial development. It seems to be responding to ways in which it can create other kind of co-benefits, including jobs and other co-benefits. But still, I think it would be really important to try and have a very objective perspective about what really is this hydrogen about for African development. We've heard of Mauritania, and I don't know how much water, for example, Mauritania has. Mauritania, as far as I know, is a water-scarce country. Namibia is another one, where there is a huge, investment that is being planned. So in some ways, it's really to have a sense of what hydrogen brings in terms of benefits, but also some of the associated risks. I have a few other maybe, and maybe by the end of this discussion, perhaps we may have to continue this this discussion beyond today, is to really lay out some research potentials for CCG and its partners. Where are the problem areas that need to be investigated further? I mean, for example, I don't know how much life cycle analysis, maybe Carla, you might be able to shed some light on that. How much LCA type of work has been done, from cradle to different aspects of hydrogen, but also the social aspects, maybe even social relations associated with each of the steps in the whole hydrogen value chain, for example. So just this is a moment to really sort of think and reflect. And I think Philip, you've been following some of that debate, maybe not necessarily here, but I know that you've been your thoughts.
Thanks, Jakob, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Maybe you wanted to invite somebody, kind of, the pro and the con. Let me just, for the sake of it, play the pro hydrogen person, just laying out a couple of potential benefits in terms of the size of the economic opportunity and the social and the environmental opportunity, in terms of the diversity of impact, of positive impact hydrogen can have, green hydrogen can have for Africa, and in terms of finance. So these three things I just wanted to touch on. First one is size. So just to give you one example, Mauritania has, as Steffi just said, there's a second green hydrogen plant of 13 gigawatts that they have announced here at COP. There is another one, the size of it is 30 gigawatts, the Amman green hydrogen plant, where multiple MOUs have been signed. The investment volume of that green hydrogen project alone, that one green hydrogen project, is $40 billion US. The annual GDP of Mauritania is 8 billion. So this one project is 5 times the size of the entire economy. I don't know, maybe in this fine distinguished panel you can find an example where something like this has happened. I've never seen anything like this, where one project is the size of 5 times your GDP. There is tremendous potential, but of course, tremendous risk associated with that. So just to lay that out, and also across the sub-Saharan African region, we have an installed capacity of roughly slightly below 100 gigawatts. This one, the entire 48 countries, this one project is 30. So just to illustrate kind of the size of what we're talking here. The second, in terms of diversity, and this is, I think, a key thing that we have to remember. Hydrogen is very different green hydrogen is very different from natural gas or from coal or from oil in terms of when we talk about the resource curse issue, because of course you have resource curse risks there, but you do have to have quite a large part of the value chain within Africa, and that's different. So you have to generate the electricity first, you have to do that in Africa, and then the idea with green hydrogen production is that you then have to use this electricity and also have to solve the water issue. You have to desalinate the water, so you have to have desalination plants, and then you have to create produce the green hydrogen. That's an industrial process. So we're talking about a large industrialization measure, an industrialization process, which is different from just extracting natural gas and just sending it away. So there's these industrial processes which can diversify economies and get taxes into these countries and create a lot more jobs than an extractive kind of natural gas economy could ever do. And again, the issue with water would be there's actually you could think about it as a co-benefit. So especially where you have scarcity of drinking water, these large investments, there's a huge windfall then from desalination plants where you can then use some of the water as actual drinking water. So that's on the diversity, and then on finance. There is a clear demand from Europe, a clear demand from the US for decarbonization. And given if you can bring down the cost of capital enough, Africa has this unique, many African countries has this unique competitive advantage in green hydrogen. It's just not possible to produce green hydrogen at the cost in Europe that you can do in Africa if the cost of capital is low enough. So this competitive advantage will drive investments in, and that is something that you might not necessarily see in other sectors where, if I think most African countries have an industrialization policy, and you get investments most easily where you have a competitive advantage. Here you have one, or at least you have the potential to have one. So this could, be a lever to crowd in a lot of this investment that we hear so much. So I'll stop there, and I'm not 100% pro hydrogen, but I just wanted to make those points.
Thank you, Philip. So I guess maybe one point to make here, I guess we're not talking whether you are pro or con of green hydrogen. I think the idea is to have a discussion. I do wonder whether someone actually wants to maybe play the devil's advocate and actually talk about some of the concerns that are also out there. Because, there's no doubt that the excitement of COP is very big, but I think it also means that some of the more critical conversations around green hydrogen are actually not brought to the forefront and discussed about. And I wonder whether someone wants to be brave enough. Ed?
Thanks. I think one of the concerns that typically comes with extraction of seawater is what do you do with the salinity, the salt that emerges out of it. So I don't know. I don't know if there's because most of the time you take it back to the sea, that's what I've seen, and that makes the sea a bit more saline, and the environment for the marine environment changes, so that could affect biodiversity and stuff like that. I don't know the technology around green hydrogen, but I'm just reflecting upon that with an environmental perspective. You said something quite interesting about what makes that Africa is competitive when it comes to green hydrogen investment. I'm curious to know why. So.
If I could just make a general point, one of my mentors used to tell me that today's problems were all yesterday's solutions. And many times we run into things not necessarily looking at the long-term impacts, or, sometimes we can't do that. And, we have to make decisions. So we're in a bit of a difficult position. I guess the thing that is really important from the point of view of a program like Climate Compatible Growth is to really quickly come away with objective information that can be used to help empower decision making, and to not just ask these critical questions, but also quantify what some of those answers are potentially going to be. It's clear that there are grey hydrogen markets and products like fertilizers and other things that are produced by companies that are going to be under pressure to decarbonize. So it appears that there's a clear market opportunity on the one hand. On the other hand, there are questions about the energy density of this as a fuel, using ammonia to replace natural gas, having all kinds of other issues associated, which are all, important. And then with respect to the endogenization and the industrialization, Philip, the point is well taken. In fact, it's even more extreme if you were to have a look at, say, the DRC and its cobalt reserves. It's got sitting on trillions of dollars of cobalt reserves, which is several orders of magnitude than the country's GDP. And yet there are serious concerns about whether or not there will be social justice, whether or not things will be set up in a way that the transition, like getting that stuff out of the ground and doing all of these other things, is actually going to uplift, basic communities and uplift societies and uplift, inclusive GDP growth. And I could see all kinds of opportunities and dangers with setting up systems where, we're so keen on mitigating risk that we, lock out a lot of players that we may want to include. In particular, some of the capacity building that you may want to come along with that. If we rush into this without empowering universities to have engineers and all kinds of other things to come up with local solutions, I could see particularly difficult problems. So all of that to say, I'm neither pro nor anti-hydrogen, but maybe I'll paint a slightly more pessimistic question pessimistic viewpoint by the questions that I'm asking. which just necessitates for the academic community in particular just this urgency to understand what the implications potentially are to increase agency, to improve decision making, to improve the potential for a just transition, and to make sure that what appears to be a solution for today does not become a problem for tomorrow.
Thanks, Mark. And just to reflect on one point you made around the talk I went today to, it was very clear that no one actually spoke about the role of green hydrogen for the African continent. It was spoken about as hydrogen as a development, and mainly particularly for export. However, one of the speakers said that Africa needs to make its point or its case, and I think that is foremost important here, that, how is the hydrogen being used within the country, but then also for export use. And I think that's just what you're also saying, like it's kind of like where we are not focusing on enough on. Bernard, I wonder whether you would like to reflect perhaps where Zambia is, or, if you want to come in from that point of view.
Sure. I won't really speak on where Zambia is, but it's just the same debate around natural resource economics or natural resource discussions. The issue of extracting everything and you take it to a market, or what Philip said when he says much of the financing is external. For me, immediately it raised the flag, because that's what you see in cobalt mining, that's what you see in copper mining. You get the mineral, you take it out. And if you look at, say, you can use natural green hydrogen for production of electricity, for example, or other, use it in vehicles and stuff. You have to ask yourself, the people actually who are working in that industry, how much of that are they using? And if you say it's a very small portion, then you immediately know that it's an extractive industry. And extractive industries always create social problems. People they might be employed in it, but people, whenever they look at a topic or an industry in that respect, they just regard it as one of those things that are benefiting others. So the issue, therefore, of the behavior of a private investor, for example, if you know that you are able to bring capital on the table, you care less about what's happening in that country. All you want is a return on that capital. And anything that you're going to export is not going to bring social stability. So for me, that would be the issue that would be a concern.
Thanks, Bernard. And of course, there are bigger political issues that one needs to consider when you're looking at, especially this kind of scale. We've seen that even with the Desert Tech project, this concentrated solar, which had such a huge promise and didn't quite deliver. But also, as Bernard said, potentially there are going to be some political economy questions. In a sense, the question is, whose agenda is this? Whose program is it? Whose, are we in a situation where global decarbonization can become, a challenge for communities further afield? We see that, with the cobalt, for instance, that the injustices that we see within the mining sector at the moment. There's some work, that was done by, Benjamin Sovakul and colleagues. I think they called it decarbonization and its discontents. But, there are these issues which still remain unresolved. But of course, the other challenge is the speed at which, things are moving. This is essentially quite unprecedented in terms of the whole rollout of hydrogen in green hydrogen in Namibia, and in a place like Mauritania, which doesn't have the industrial capability to be able to operate in a very independent sense, but rather, it seems like at least, in the short term, this will be driven by northern institutions and interests. What's your view there, Miron? Was there anything you would like to add? You are our political politics person, but you don't have to stay there.
Yes, and I think everyone has already touched upon a lot of things. It's again something that continues to happen over and over again, and we're back in the same place. It's about a matter of whether we can think about this systematically. And one of the main things, for example, is we haven't seen any debate in Africa about these things. We haven't seen debates on media or among civil society groups or even among professionals that work in Africa to decide whether this kind of thing works. And again, Africa is a bit big word because we're only talking about 3-4 countries that have gone into this. But the fact that we are also talking about it as an Africa thing means there's also an assumption that others are going to follow. And if that is the case, then we still kind of need to go back into thinking about who's setting the agenda, who's making the decision, and how much agency do people have. Like, we often, for example, hear one of the biggest challenge for energy projects is finance, but the other one is access to land or rights to land. And that is because land has more value for some people than the assumed value that comes with solar plants or systems. So again, what is the priority for people and how can we compromise and balance those things, especially when you're talking about water or other resources that are going to go in it, is part of the political economy.
Thank you, Maron. That's great. Which now brings me also to those that do large-scale modeling for specific countries. So, Ariane, I wondered where green hydrogen fits in currently in your energy models, or where do you see it, if you see it, to play a role within that, and where it is?
Thanks for the question, because I think it's also important when we talk about green hydrogen to know where it will be used, in which sector, and so how much will we need to reach the net zero target. So, of course, we have many global scenarios. We have scenarios for Africa with different details about green hydrogen. But generally, what we can see that the role of hydrogen is mainly in the industry sector. So if we take buildings, it plays a tiny role mainly in Europe, where it could be used maybe for heating, but there is also huge controversy around its use there. In transport, of course, it can be very useful to decarbonize the aviation sector. There is discussion around heavy duty vehicles, but for normal cars, this is not the preferred solution at the moment. I mean, this is the results of our modeling. For industry, unlike the other sectors, it will be likely very important to decarbonize. So if I take the iron and steel sector, at the moment, there are two main solutions, either to produce iron and steel with CCS solutions, so to carbon capture storage, or hydrogen. So then the question is, how much steel do we need in a net zero world? So this is a question that, of course, we incorporate. And for Africa, I don't have the numbers, unfortunately, but I doubt that green hydrogen will be needed for the sector itself, like for the industrial sector in Africa, for the short term. Maybe for the long term, it will play a more important role.
So basically what you're saying is that it's very depending on the specific sector, and does it then, from your point of view, also depend on the alternative that are already out there in that specific sector?
Yes, absolutely. So, of course, if you have other alternatives that are more cheap, of course, this would be the preferred solution. That's my 2 cents.
Can you briefly reflect, and perhaps I might be dropping you into something here, but maybe on where you think, from your knowledge of the varying sector, where you think there's actually no net zero alternatives potentially, or lower carbon alternatives, and where you think from your current models where it actually might have a role at the moment?
So as I said, for instance, the iron and steel industry, there is huge uncertainty around CCS. I mean, the amount of CCS that we can use to decarbonize the iron and steel industry depends, of course, on the country. Some countries have a lot of storage that are available. So we could, of course, imagine to send the CO2 that we capture somewhere and send it somewhere else.
Yeah.
But of course, there is also, again, huge discussion about how we send the carbon that is captured and everything. So in that case, for some countries, it seems that the hydrogen solution will be almost necessary.
Great, thank you. And with that, I want to quickly hop over to the transport sector. Friedel, I wonder whether you had any sort of reflections from your point of view.
Yeah, thanks. I work for GIZ, and in GIZ also the topic of hydrogen has become very, very popular. And for me, that's an expression, I think, of what our donors are interested in, but also of the opportunities that our partner countries see in this topic. I do work in the transport sector, and there also we talk a lot about hydrogen as a solution for the aviation sector, as you already mentioned, as a solution for maritime shipping. So the big ocean vessels that carry containers around the world. Of course, it's not a solution, as you rightly said, for passenger cars, for smaller vehicles. But the question is it a solution for trucks, for heavy goods vehicles? And there one again needs to differentiate a lot between different applications. So for urban transport, freight vehicles, no, they can be electrified. Probably also for most of the longer range trucks, but then there may be niche applications of trucks that carry very heavy loads that have to go very long distances where it does make sense. Or trucks that operate in a very remote area where it will be difficult to have the charging electricity supply, or where hydrogen is readily available, maybe. So that's where it could make sense. And when I came here to COP, I was sitting on the plane next to an energy systems expert, and he was talking to me about the transport of hydrogen. And what he said, what I didn't know before, was that transporting hydrogen is quite difficult because it needs to be cooled that much. So best to transport it via pipeline, which you cannot do over very long distances. So his point was use the hydrogen where it is produced, because shipping it around the world, maybe that is good for ammonia or other products in that context, but for hydrogen as such, for local applications, for fueling airplanes in Africa or shipping.
Thank you. Yeah, that's often a part that is forgotten about, basically hydrogen carriers, how are you transporting it, etc., etc. So I want to briefly get back to Maron, and both Philip touched up on something about the huge need for renewables and obviously land implications, but also actually how much renewables we need to produce, or how much renewables we need in order to produce green hydrogen. With that, I would like to go over to Carla, who obviously really works on, supply chains, value chains, embedded carbon, and so on. And I wonder whether you could briefly reflect on some maybe of the material implications, centering around green hydrogen. Thanks.
Yes, so I guess it's going back a bit to what Ariane was already hinting, in that there's only a few sectors where it makes sense to use hydrogen, like steel, and steel is definitely going to be needed for making infrastructure, and that includes, not only things that go into power plants, but things that go into other kinds of systems that are needed. But I suppose there's this competition. I'm struggling to really, imagine hydrogen being actively used in this context that we're discussing, because of all the implications that there are for materials, for building this infrastructure, and for the energy that needs to be renewable so that this can actually come to fruition. I'm just putting out a few points, but I guess they're a good summary.
I suppose that opened up a lot of research questions there for you to look into, Carla, and your team in Cambridge. So McKenna, I want to jump over to you, and I gave you a pre-warning by saying your name first, because I know I have also made you. So McKenna's been our panelist in a previous session where we spoke about, inclusiveness and, equitable energy transition. And, I know that green hydrogen is not really your area of expertise, but I mean, ultimately what it touches upon is about like how emerging technologies are actually brought into the discussion, and I'm sure there's many things to learn. And I just wondered whether you might have some reflections around like where you see some of the greatest concerns, particularly around, the equitable part of this.
Yeah, thanks. You're right. Green energy is not my area of expertise, but I wanted to stay in this session because I've also learned a lot just by listening to you all. And what it's really brought to my mind is the parallels that it has with things that I know, which is distributed renewable energy in the energy access space. And one of my reflections is that in the energy access space, we've learned to stop talking too much about supply and really think about demand. Start with the demand-led approach. And I think that's what you were saying about first we need to size the potential. How much green hydrogen do we actually need? Because what we've ended up with in the energy space is a lot of oversupply, centralized supply that isn't reaching the people we thought would use that energy. And seeing that parallel sort of start to appear, you talking about the distribution challenges, again, I see that parallel in the energy supply side, where we do have a real problem with distributing energy. And that leads to very inequitable solutions and very inequitable use of that energy. So I think my thing is just looking at how the discussion is proceeding and thinking about some of the pitfalls that we've seen on our side and trying to navigate those. I think also something else that has crystallized for me is this a new shiny new object, right? We've had that in the energy space as well, right? The new shiny thing that everybody wants to concentrate on and kind of advance because it's a sexy thing to talk about right now. And how do you bring data so that governments and everyone else can prioritize it along with all the other shiny new objects that could probably solve some of those solutions already, some of those problems. So I think about that and really this call for the right data to help the decision making so that where it's not needed, we don't go there. But where it's needed, we do because we have the data that underpins that. So I guess those are my small reflections listening to you all.
Thanks, McKenna. You drew some very interesting parallels there. And what I particularly liked about your comment is you immediately went to, hey, this is what we need to do. So I wonder whether anyone else might want to contribute what we actually think what needs to happen in order, passing over.
Thanks, Steffi. No, I was going to pass it to Philip as the person who's advocating for it. So I mean, in a sense, it's not to, it's not to try and put you on the spot, but you've heard, from the inclusive or the colleagues in the social sciences, who keep an eye on the distributional effects of any kind of intervention from political economies, from materials, from everyone. So you're the Mauritania negotiator on this issue. And I mean, what are the things, if you really are interested to make sure that Mauritania is not taken for a ride, what is it that it needs to do? What are the kinds of red lines that it should not pass? So in a sense, you're the prime minister or whatever, who has to make sure that Mauritania gets the maximum value out of this deal.
Yeah, that's my dream job, being the president of Mauritania. So thank you for that. And of course, I kind of play this role to try to make it a bit interesting. So and I hear the concerns here, and they're very valid. I do want to make a couple of points though, and something that I think can be done. We have, I think, a lot of examples, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where extractive industries and extractive resources have been damaging and bad. There are a couple of positive examples, though. Think about Botswana. Botswana is one of the leading economies in sub-Saharan Africa. They have built their wealth on the back of diamonds, which are extremely valuable. It's quite easy to mine. You don't need a lot of people. They have managed to build a very strong democracy, very strong institutions, and a very diverse economy on the backbone of diamond money. Norway is one again, and where they have managed to do this on energy exports. What do Norway and Botswana have in common is strong institutions, and the ability of having these strong institutions. And with Acemoglu and Robinson, why nations fail, if you use their argument, is that these strong institutions have allowed them to redistribute this money that they get. And I think that's a key thing that has to happen in any industry that is of this amount, this size, 5 times the complete GDP. You have to have strong institutions that redistribute this and diversify. And that goes, with building the skills you need for this specific area, but you also need it to build other, infrastructure and other skills and diversify the economy. So that's absolutely has to happen. One example I love to give here is how China is doing it. China they open up their market to, and I used to work for McKinsey, and I did this project with a German car manufacturer, right? And they see this German market, the Chinese market, and of course they want to sell there. China has a rule where they say, you can come to our market, but here's some, if you want to have them, it's the same, with Africa, with the great sunlight, they have this market size, the market opportunity. China says, you can come, but you have to have a 50-50 joint venture with a Chinese car manufacturer. Their technology, of course, very, very inferior to the German, great car manufacturers. The Germans are still coming. Each and every company is in China and building these cars in a 50-50 joint venture where you have the technology transfer kind of forced upon you. And why, can we think of models where Mauritania says, we have this great sunlight, you guys want to decarbonize, we see all this investment. Can we come up with structures that actually ensure that there is technology transfer, that there's skills transfer, and that we can build these own benefits. And I think what currently is happening in this rush is that we're not really doing that. We're kind of, yesterday I saw that the president of Zimbabwe and the president of Botswana, and they were on a panel. There were some private sector people, and they had all these great plans how their technology can advance Africa. And all the presidents were just saying, "Oh, Botswana is open for business. Like Zimbabwe were open for business." Think more, think better. You have there's some power that you have, and you need to have arrangements, I think, that build on that. And then the final thing is in terms of there's something just in the concrete process, and I think we heard the demand question a lot, and this is then going into the practicalities of it. As you start to do this at a smaller scale, you need to think about how can you sell hydrogen and who gets it. And I completely agree that there needs to be a domestic part of it, and there probably needs to be an export part of it. And just as a thought, it makes sense to look at which industry, and there are a couple, the chemical industry we haven't mentioned, for instance. The chemical industry is going to need green hydrogen. There's no real credible pathway for them decarbonizing without green hydrogen. At least I haven't heard one. So what you then can target, you can target in the chemical industry those sub-industries that have really high margins and can actually afford hydrogen at a higher cost, where you target it first and then kind of have a merit order of different demand cases, and the same you can do in country. So I think there's a lot of things that you need to do, but there are certainly preconditions to make that happen.
Thank you for that, Philip. And now I'm going to drop it over to Meron before passing it to Bernard, because I'm very interested what you think about the comparison to China and Botswana in the context of the rest of Africa as a political economist.
Yes, I wanted to jump in, but I realized this is a polite group of people, so I need to keep quiet. That is the tricky bit, because the reality is different, and the ambition and best practice examples and what needs to be done there is a huge gap, and the gap is not an unintended one. It's an intended gap, and it's not from lack of knowledge that you kind of need that kind of an institution, or local content policy is important. It is a matter of not doing it. And I think that is where the political economy thing comes, and also where the symbiotic relationships exist between the economic elites and political elites, between international and national elites, as well as how other institutions are structured in a way that whether they are allowed to engage in the conversation or not. And I think that is the problem. Our institutions are structurally, most of the countries' institutions are structurally limited in creating that space, let alone for the redistribution to be done in a way that some other countries have done it, but also in a way that sometimes civil servants are not even in a position to convince their own politicians. So that is the reality. Our reality is not Africa's reality is not China's reality, and given what we have, how can we move out of there, and how can we create a path is a good. And new technology sometimes could probably be an opportunity to create that conversation. But now that we're rushing these things through, we miss that opportunity yet again to work with the structures. I mean, I can go on and on and on.
We only have 5 minutes left. So passing over to Bernard, who I know also wanted to jump in here, if you could keep it somewhat brief.
Sure. I'm just wondering, is this green hydrogen an issue of just postponing the decisions that have to be made today? You know, you bring in like the way CCS was, right? We are going to burn more coal, but we are going to develop how to capture it. So we are all focused on what's going on in CCS technology and stuff. And now it's all quiet. We've now moved to green hydrogen. Is it just a way of kicking the can down the road, where we say, well, we don't want to make tough decisions, or we don't want to be seen to move, so we say there's this huge potential, 5 times in Mauritania, for example, than the GDP. And then we're all quiet because we are interested to see what's going to turn out, opportunities that are going to come out from this resource if it's developed, when maybe nothing's going to come out. Just wondering.
It might be, and I was going to go back to the PM of Mauritania, but I mean, given that it's Philip, I'm probably going to skip that part because it would be very interesting to actually hear that from the people that are making these decisions, right? Please, Mark.
Just very quickly, 2 points, and these are reflective. So I'm taking my CCG hat off for a moment and just throwing out a couple of ideas. The first is that, you know, one of the ways to incorporate some of the things you've been talking about, Philip, with the Botswana example, is just to ensure, and I think there may be an urgency about this, and that's to ensure that corporate sort of responsibility associated with these big funds is that there is a just transition, and that has to be, you know, articulated really quite clearly and be open to scrutiny. And I think that's really important because these funds are getting big and they're getting fast. The next point is, again, this is just conjecture, but I think it's worth looking into. You know, this is not a zero-sum game, right? So part of the attraction for green hydrogen, you stick some solar panels, you put the hydrogen plant in there, foreign direct investment, it keeps one stakeholder happy. But it's also something that you can de-risk financially relatively easily. This is not the least cost, most important thing to do if you wanted to decarbonize the world right now and improve people's lives. There are lots and lots of other things to do, but they're a little bit more tricky, whereas this thing is nice and convenient, potentially. And there's a problem, because let's say these systems were to scale incredibly quickly. An alternative solution to decarbonizing, which is probably better for everybody, in the short term, in terms of urgent things to do, developing global green grids, for example. We simply don't have the capacity to manufacture the cables that would be required to develop these mega grids. And yet we were going to take what is relatively scarce capacity and move it into something else which may hinder development that's needed elsewhere fast, which would speak to something important around scheduling the capacity that's required for this massive revolution in these systems. And the warning sign that goes off in my mind is that, you know, when money is mobile and there's lots of money, it is going to start to flow fast, as it did with the financial crash. I mean, who in their right mind would be invested in subprime mortgages if it weren't for the fact that you could do it easily and play those systems? And it's not just that you're taking, resources, those sorts of, human resources and financial resources away from other things, but you may potentially also be, locking out land. If you're using swathes of solar panels and so on land that could perhaps be used for other things that could perhaps generate different kinds of income and development patterns that may be important, but would be overlooked because it's not as liquid. So I would suggest two things: corporate responsibility urgently with respect to justice, and the other one is just to take a step back and understand. We heard the other day, $2 trillion worth of financing in the green bonds market, and they're looking to move that. And we hear difficulties with governments getting access to financing for the projects that they want. And I think we might be careful. This could be something that sucks things out and creates a kind of lock-in in an indirect way that we hadn't seen. But I'm just throwing those out there as ideas for folk to follow up on. Thanks.
Unfortunately, we have come to the time, and as a German person, we have to. It's my responsibility to finish this in time. But what I just want to say is that obviously, what was more of a spontaneous and diverse panel actually turned out super interesting, because we were able to draw on so much different expertise and knowledge here that we usually not able to. But maybe can I just ask one final thing, and I don't know who will answer this, so I'm going to open it up to everyone, including the audience in the room. So as CCG, and obviously as researchers with a vast amount of different expertise and knowledge, maybe not on green hydrogen, but on other things that we've learned, and also practitioners that we have here in the room, what do you think us as CCG can do in the next year until we meet again at COP28? And I wonder whether someone has a thought on this, and if not, I invite you to write it into Slido and let us know, and we see whether we can do that. Unless someone would like to come in here?
Objective information.
Not plenty, but you need to put the case this plainly, right? And put it to the decision makers with the information in this plain way of speaking, and tell them what they're losing and what they're going to gain. But remember to say what they might lose as they're gaining the green hydrogen.
Anyway, great. With that, I think we give ourselves a very loud applause.